The rain started at dusk and didn't stop by midnight. I fitted the last wooden plank into the door frame and brushed the dust off my hands. Above me, the sign for my shop, the Zong Mo bookstore, swayed in the wind. The rain had blurred the ink on the sign, and a chipped corner made the word ink look like earth. A merchant once poked his head in to ask if I sold erotic art. I just smiled, ushered him out, and used my brush to fix the character. Now it looked even worse, but I didn't care. I didn't rely on the sign for business. I was a transcriber. My handwriting was good, my prices were low, and my mouth was shut. I always had plenty of work. As the door clicked shut, the shop fell silent. I lit an oil lamp and opened a volume of Tsang Lang Chronicles. My brush moved steadily, small, neat characters flowing onto the paper. By the third page, I tilted my head slightly. My hand didn't stop, but my ears were searching. Beyond the rhythm of the rain, there was something else. 3 people. The first set of footsteps was frantic and uneven. Someone was injured. The other 2 were flanking the first, their steps light and fast. They weren't breathing. That was the hallmark of professional assassins. I didn't stop writing. I reached the part about the Tsang Lang River flowing southwest when the sound stopped right outside my door. I set the brush down and sighed. I considered pretending to be asleep, but then a heavy thud hit the door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a body collapsing against the wood. Then came a second sound, the sharp crack of a blade splitting timber. Wood chips flew as a sword wedged itself into the door. I knew exactly how thick those planks were. A standard wood axe wouldn't dent them in 3 hits. This person had buried a blade 3 inches deep in a single strike. That meant high-quality steel and a master who didn't care about making noise. They intended to kill everyone, including any witnesses. I blew out the lamp and retreated behind the counter. I reached into a hidden compartment. It didn't hold gold or silver, only a palm-sized iron box containing a yellowed manuscript titled on public instruments. I pressed my hand against the box, holding it down like a lid that must never be opened. "Open the door," a woman's voice rasped. It was short, forced through gritted teeth. I didn't move. "I know you're in there," she hissed. "You heard the Tianji Pavilion killers. Once they're done with me, you're next. Open up, and we both might live. If you don't." She paused, sounding like she was either laughing or spitting up blood. "Then you can just bury my body." I stayed silent for a moment, then pulled my hand away from the iron box. I walked to the door and slid the bolt back. A woman was half kneeling on the threshold. Her left hand was clamped over her right ribs, but blood still leaked through her fingers, turning the rainwater a pale red. Her wet hair clung to her face, leaving only her eyes visible, cold, sharp, and filled with a desperate ferocity. Behind her stood 2 men in black. One was yanking his sword out of my door. The other held a thin blade pointed directly at the woman's neck. The swordsman narrowed his eyes at me. "This has nothing to do with you. Close the door. Go back to sleep. You saw nothing." I should have closed the door. I had lived in this alley for 3 years, and my only rule was never to get involved in things that didn't concern me. But then I saw what the woman was holding. She pulled an iron medallion from her robe. It was palm-sized, rusted at the edges, with a single character engraved in the center, Zong. My pupils contracted. I recognized that medallion. My father had left one almost exactly like it, though his was engraved with the word foam. It had been sitting in a box under my bed for 10 years. Something I hadn't dared to touch for a decade was now being thrust in front of my face by a bleeding woman. I looked up at the assassin. "She's right," I said. "Once you kill her, I'm next. People like you don't like leaving witnesses." The man went silent for a heartbeat, then nodded. "You're a smart man. Pity you realized it too late." The other man finally freed his blade. It whistled through the rain in a silver arc, aimed straight for my throat. It was fast, so fast the door frame hummed from the pressure of the strike. But I was faster. I stepped aside, retreated, and ducked in one fluid motion. The blade grazed my scalp, cutting nothing but my hair tie. I didn't reach out to block the sword. Instead, I grabbed the woman. Inside, I grunted. I hauled her through the front hall and into a narrow crawl space between my shop and the pawn shop next door. It was a secret escape route I'd built 3 years ago when I first rented the place. I kicked open the side door at the end of the passage, and the cold wind rushed in. The woman slumped against me. Up close, I realized she was in worse shape than I thought. She had at least 2 stab wounds in her ribs and a long gash running from her shoulder to her waist. Footsteps echoed in the alley. I scooped her up and ducked into a maze of backstreets. She was unnervingly light. Blood ran down my arm, mixing with the rain before being washed away from the cobblestones. I stopped at a collapsing wooden gate at the end of the alley, an abandoned courtyard where an old scholar had died the year before. I laid her on a broken bed and lit a stub of a candle. The light revealed a young, sharp-featured face beneath the blood. Her eyebrows were straight and dark, her lips pressed thin. Even unconscious, she looked guarded. Her right hand gripped the medallion so tightly I couldn't pry it loose. I studied the medallion in the candlelight. One side said Zong. The back featured a broken sword. It was identical to my father's, except for the word. One was Zong, the other Foam. Together, they meant hidden seal. A chill crept into my palm. I turned my attention to her wounds. They were deep, but missed her vital organs. Whoever did this didn't want her dead immediately. They wanted her to run until she bled out. I'd read about this technique in my father's book. It was called a life-demanding charm. If the bleeding wasn't stopped within the hour, she was a dead woman. I scavenged a bottle of liquor and some yellowed cotton cloth from the old scholar's cupboard. I began to clean, disinfect, and stitch. My hands were steady, too steady for a simple transcriber. I didn't have thread, so I used strands of hair, a technique from the Manual of Golden Sores. As I stitched the wound on her back, her body tensed. Zong Foam, she muttered. My hand froze. In Songlang City, a bookstore, bring him back. Her voice sounded like a dream, or perhaps a command. I sat by the bed, my fingers tracing the medallion. I remembered my father's final moments. It was a bitterly cold winter. He was skeletal, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. I was 14 then. I leaned in close, my ear to his mouth. He managed only one word. Xia. Then black blood choked his throat, cutting off the rest. For 10 years, I thought he was saying, thank you. Now, I realized he wasn't expressing gratitude. He was saying a name. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. I stood by the window all night until the sky turned a bruised gray. When the woman finally woke, I was cooking porridge. She bolted upright, her hand instinctively flying to her waist. It's on the table, I said without looking back, stirring the pot. Your short sword, too. I stitched your ribs with hair. The back wound is deep. Don't fight anyone for 3 months. Who are you? She demanded. I should be asking you that, I replied. You broke down my door, ruined my property, dragged me into a fight with Tianji Pavilion, and showed me a medallion you shouldn't have. You talk first. She was quiet for a long moment. Gu Shuangshu. Your real name. That is my real name now. Her eyes sharpened, pinning me down. You know about Tianji Pavilion. Who are you? My name is Shunyi. I'm the owner of the Zong Mo bookstore just outside Songlang City. That's my real name. I've never changed it, and I've never had a reason to. I ladled out 2 bowls of porridge and set one on the table. You broke my door, I said, my voice flat. You owe me a new one. Gu Shuangshu stared at me for a long time. Then, her gaze dropped to my waist, where the edge of the iron medallion peeked out from my robe. You touched my things, she noted. Her voice was weak, but there was a sharp edge to it. That medallion. It isn't something you should be handling. Then why don't you tell me what it is first? I countered. We locked eyes. I held my bowl, looking relaxed, but my gaze didn't waver. I wasn't joking. Gu Shuangshu's face was pale, yet her eyes were like unsheathed blades. Your name is Shunyi, she said, breaking the silence. You're 24 years old, a local of Songlang City. Your mother died early, and your father passed away when you were 14. You live alone, running this bookstore and copying manuscripts to survive. You've never associated with the martial arts world. My smile faded slightly. How do you know all that? She didn't answer. Instead, she asked a question that nearly made me drop my porridge. Was your father's name Shin Qingshan? The room went dead silent. The only sound was the bubbling of the pot on the stove. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who the hell are you? Gu Shuangshu gripped the edge of the bed and forced herself to stand. Even wounded, her back was straight as a spear. My name is Gu Shuangshu. I'm a rank B assassin from Tianji Pavilion. My mission was to kill you. She paused, catching her breath. But I didn't do it. I betrayed the pavilion instead. Because the person who hired me told me one thing. Your existence is tied to the fall of the Zhu Sword sect 40 years ago. I stared at her, the last traces of my casual mask vanishing. The Zhu Sword sect, I repeated. The words felt like they were being unearthed from a deep, dark grave. How much do you know? She pointed toward the medallion in my hand. Not much, but I know what that character on the medallion means. It's a lock. She looked me dead in the eye. And you are the thing it's locking away. I didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Songlang City was waking up. I could hear the distant cries of street vendors, the rattle of merchant carts, and the laughter of children. It was the sound of a normal, peaceful life. But the iron medallion pressed against my chest felt like a piece of ice, freezing my skin. I stood up and handed her the bowl of porridge. Eat. When you're finished, we're going back to the bookstore. You still have to pay for my door. Gu Xuanshu took the bowl and took a sip. It was plain rice porridge, seasoned only with salt, but it was perfectly hot. When she looked up, I was already at the doorway, staring down the cobblestone alley. Hey, she called out. Why don't you run? I didn't turn around. My voice carried clearly through the morning air. I've been running for 10 years. I'm tired. I stepped over the threshold and into the sunlight. My back felt thin, my posture lazy, my sleeves fluttering in the morning breeze. Gu Xuanshu watched me disappear around the corner. She suddenly remembered something her master had said before dying. Song Feng is not an arrow, nor a man, nor a technique. Song Feng is a choice. When you see it, you will know. She finished the porridge, leaned against the wall to stand, and followed me. Back at the shop, I knelt by the entrance and ran my fingers over the gashes in the wood. 3 inches deep, I muttered. A refined steel dagger with a curved blade. The user pulls back during the strike to tear the wound open. That's a Tianji Pavilion signature. That's how you got hurt, isn't it? Gu Xuanshu leaned against the doorframe. She had changed into some old gray clothes I'd scavenged from old Kai's wardrobe. They were too big, but they hid the bloody bandages on her back. Her face was paper white, but her voice remained cold. You're just a scribe. How do you know about weapons? I read books, I said, standing up to brush the wood shavings off my robe. Weapons manuals, the Golden Window secrets, illustrations of 100 blades. I have copies of all of them in the shop. I suggest you read the chapter on recovery in the Golden Window secrets. The shop looked exactly as it had the night before. The manuscript I was copying sat on the counter, the ink long dry. The shelves were neat, the floor clean. Aside from the broken door, there was no sign an assassin had been here. Gu Xuanshu scanned the shelves. You keep martial arts manuals in a bookstore? Sure. Taizu Long Fist, 18R Hood Hands, Common Street versions. 3 silver pieces each. Want a set? I mean real manuals. I chuckled. Why would real manuals be for sale in a shop like this? The way you moved last night, she said, her eyes pinning me. A sidestep, a retreat, a duck. 3 movements performed as one. You dodged a full-strength strike from a Tianji assassin. You didn't learn that from a street version manual. My hand hesitated for a split second as I rinsed my brush. Then I continued, my tone light. My dad taught me a few moves for self-defense when I was a kid. After he died, I stopped practicing. Your father, Shin Qingshan. I told you, I know who he was. Who was he then? I looked up, water dripping from my brush. He was a failed scholar in Songlang City. He spent his life frustrated and died so poor I could barely afford a coffin. If you're interested, go check the old records at the city morgue. You'll find his burial entry there. You're lying. I am. I set the brush down and leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms. My lazy expression was gone. Something sharp and hidden was surfacing in my eyes. You smashed through my door in the middle of the night, showed me a medallion you shouldn't have, and told me you were here to kill me. If you were me, would you tell the truth to someone you've known for less than a day? The shop went quiet. Gu Xuanshu walked slowly to the counter and sat down. Every step clearly hurt, but her face remained a mask of indifference. Her endurance reminded me of a wounded leopard. The weaker she felt, the less she showed it. I was adopted by Tianji Pavilion when I was 10, she said suddenly. Her voice was flat, as if she were reading someone else's biography. First kill at 13. Became a rank B assassin at 15. 3 months ago, I received a mission. To kill me. Yes, Only the pavilion master knows the client's identity, but the file was detailed. Your name, address, habits. It even knew what time you closed the shop and when you went to buy rice. And there was a note. Target possesses a treasure far exceeding the value of the bounty. My smile vanished completely. So I've been watched for a long time. I didn't strike immediately, she continued. I watched you for 7 days. The embroidery seller at the alley entrance 7 days ago? The old lady behind you at the rice shop 3 days ago? That was me. Disguise techniques. I went cold. No wonder I felt like someone was watching me. I thought it was just the neighbor looking to borrow money again. You didn't spot the flaw, she said. When I played the old lady, my left foot was heavier than my right. Usually, that makes a person lean left, but I leaned right. You noticed it then, didn't you? I just thought the old lady was a bit odd, I admitted. I didn't think too much of it. Your observation skills are sharp. I copy a lot of books. My eyes don't stay idle. So what happened next? Next, I realized your martial arts were far beyond the records. The file said you were a scribe who didn't know how to fight. But I saw you practicing a set of punches in your backyard. You try to make them look clumsy, but the foundation was a blend of at least 12 different styles. I decided to abort the mission and filed a risk assessment report. Gu Shuangshu's lips thinned into a hard line. The next day, my antidote didn't arrive. My expression darkened. I knew how Tianji Pavilion operated. They controlled their assassins with a poison called 1,000-pound lead. They gave out an antidote every 3 months. If you missed a dose, your internal meridians would reverse within 3 days. It was a slow, agonizing death. I had read about this in a book called The Discourse on Public Instruments. The pavilion had sent the enforcement hall after me, but not to kill. They wanted me alive. Someone had placed a high value on my head. Gu Shuangshu's eyes turned cold as he reached into his robe and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He laid it on the table between us. I looked down at the 2 lines of text. The mission had been terminated because the target's value far exceeded the initial assessment. The employer had increased the price 10 times for a live capture. There was no name at the bottom, only a bright red seal of a 7-story tower with a star hanging between the levels. The 7-star tower. It was the mark of the 7-star families. I rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of it. I didn't know anyone from the 7-star families. I was just a scribe, a man who had spent 3 years hiding in a broken alley. My only social interaction was buying 2 pounds of roasted chestnuts at the temple every month. I looked at Gu Shuangshu and asked him what he really wanted. He sat up straight, his spine as rigid as an arrow. He wanted a trade. He would protect me, and in exchange, I would help him find the employer behind all of this. I looked at him for a few seconds and laughed. He could barely walk, yet he was offering to be my bodyguard. My laugh faded when he told me that my performance the previous night was enough to keep us both safe for now. I leaned back and stared at the spiderwebs on the ceiling. I didn't want to find an employer. I didn't want anything to do with the Tianji Pavilion or the 7-star families. All I wanted was to keep my shop, save enough silver to buy the empty unit next door, and live a quiet life. Silence filled the room again. Gu Shuangshu sat there like a blade tucked back into its sheath. Then, he told me something I didn't know. He pulled out a square of yellow paper with charred edges and complex runes drawn on it. It was a soul-chasing talisman. The pavilion used these to track defectors by sensing the poison inside their bodies. The enforcement hall hadn't found us by luck. The talisman had led them straight to my door. I frowned, telling him they were clearly tracking him, not me. Gu Shuangshu looked up at me with an expression that was somewhere between an apology and cruelty. He told me that because we had stayed together for too long, the scent of the poison had rubbed off on me. The talisman was now sensing both of us. Whether I liked it or not, they were coming for me too. I stared at that charred paper for a long time. Finally, I stood up and pushed open the cracked door, letting the morning sunlight flood the room. I gave him 1 month. I would protect him for 30 days, but after that, he had to leave, regardless of whether we found the employer. He agreed. I turned to say something else, but I froze. My eyes caught a faint scratch on the edge of the hidden compartment under the counter. It looked like a fingernail had dragged across the wood. That mark wasn't there last night. I rushed behind the counter and opened the compartment. The iron box was still there, but the lid wasn't closed tight. I pulled out the book and flipped to page 17. My fingers went numb. The page was gone. It hadn't been torn out. It had been sliced away with a razor-thin blade along the binding. It was a clean, professional job. That page contained the forbidden heartbreaking palm technique. 40 years ago, a blacksmith had used that evil skill to slaughter thousands of people in a single night. I closed the book, my face turning paler than Gu Shuangshu's. Someone had been in my shop. They could have come before he crashed through my door, or while we were out last night. I told him what was missing, a technique that should have been extinct for decades. It was a move that could shatter internal organs without leaving a single mark on the skin. The manual was incomplete, lacking the method to properly end the technique. Without that, the user's meridians would snap after 49 strikes. But within those strikes, the power was enough to level a city. There were only 3 people in the world who knew about that book and what was on page 17. Me, him, and one other person. I hesitated before saying the name. Xiejio. The air in the shop seemed to turn cold when I spoke it. Gu Shuangshu's pupils shrunk. He told me Xiejio had been dead for 40 years. I told him I used to believe that too. I walked into the backyard where the old locust tree stood. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but I noticed a fresh mark on the stone stool. Someone had been sitting there recently, watching me through the back window. I reached down and picked up a scrap of paper from the leaves. My hand stopped midair. The ink on the scrap was a sickly purple-black. It was a special blend my father used to make using purple mud from the riverbed, pine soot, and fish glue. Only my father, Shin Qingshan, used that ink. I looked up at the thick canopy of the tree. The note left behind had only 6 words on it. Song Feng is still alive. The writing was cut off, as if the person had been interrupted. Gu Shuangshu took the paper and looked it over. He told me he was also looking for Song Feng. Those words hit me like a blade. I looked up at the sky. Clouds were rolling in from the southeast. The morning sun was gone, and it was about to rain again. The scrap of paper sat on my counter all morning. I held it up to the light. It was high-quality cloud pattern paper, something only the Pei family used. The handwriting was perfect, with a tiny flick at the end of each horizontal stroke. It was exactly how my father wrote. Every character looked like it was grown in a mold. Gu Shuangshu asked if I was sure it was my father's work. I told him no one could fake that purple tint in the ink. But my father had been dead for 10 years and 3 months. Gu Shuangshu asked if I was sure. I told him I saw the burial with my own eyes. I dug the grave myself in the wasteland behind the mortuary in the west of the city. It was a snowy day. The ground was frozen solid. It took me a full day to break through the earth. My voice was calm as I spoke, like I was telling a story about someone else. We used the cheapest thin wood coffin. By the time I put him in, my father's body was already stiff. His fingers were curled tight. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't straighten them. There was an old scar between his right index and middle fingers. He got it from a pair of shears when he was young. That corpse had that exact scar. I was certain the man in that coffin was my father. So the note made no sense. I placed the scrap on the table and tapped my fingers against the wood. A man who had been dead for 10 years couldn't have sat in my backyard all night. He couldn't have left a note. Gu Shuangshu said what I was thinking. Unless that body in the coffin wasn't my father. The shop went silent for a long time. A spider crawled across its web, repairing the threads broken by the wind. Outside, the morning calls of street vendors grew louder, but the air inside was heavy. I stood up and grabbed the book again. Page 17 was gone. The edge was perfectly smooth. Someone with a very steady hand had used a thin blade to slice it right along the binding. I flipped back and found a single strand of hair caught between pages 12 and 13. It was black and about 2 inches long. It was shorter than mine and thicker than Gu Shuangshu's. A man had been in here last night. I held the hair up to the light. He was about half an inch shorter than me. He was left-handed. To find my hidden compartment, open the iron box, and cut that page without waking me required a level of calm I couldn't fathom. Gu Shuangshu asked how I knew he was left-handed. I showed him the hair. The root was sliced clean, meaning he'd recently had a haircut. Then I pointed at the book. Page 17 was on the right side of the binding. Only a left-handed person could make a smooth cut from left to right like that. A right-handed person's blade would have veered outward. The edge wouldn't be this straight. Gu Shuangshu stared at me. His sharp, calculating gaze shifted into something else. It wasn't surprise. It was more like he was confirming a suspicion. He asked if I was really just a simple book transcriber. I told him a transcriber has to know how to repair books too. You have to understand paper grain, binding methods, and the different marks left by various blades. I gave him a small smile, but there was no joy in it. I turned to the very last page and stopped. There was a tiny mark in the blank space of the back cover. It was a crescent moon pressed into the paper with a thumbnail. You couldn't even see it unless the light hit it just right. My father taught me this code. A single crescent meant a specific month. A double meant danger. A triple meant Suli. This mark was wider than a single, but smaller than a double. The depth was uneven. The person's hand had been shaking. I looked up. This mark meant someone was coming. Gu Shuangshu's back went rigid. He asked if my father left it. I told him it might have been the thief. He finished the book and left this mark for the next person who would look at it. He knew I would find it. He knew I would recognize the code. He wasn't trying to hide from me. He was telling me that he wasn't alone. The thief had accomplices. There were more than just the 3 people we knew about. I closed the book and walked to the backyard. The old locust tree cast a massive shadow over the dirt. I knelt by the stone stool and brushed away the fallen leaves. The rain should have leveled the ground, but there was a shallow depression a foot away from the stool. A footprint. The stride grew shorter near the end, meaning he had slowed down before stopping. He stood here for a while, then he sat. He sat for at least 2 hours. I found a small, burnt-down candle stub in the leaves. A new candle lasts about 2 hours. He stayed until it burned out. I followed the trail to the base of the wall. The last footprint was deeper, with the toes pointing toward the bricks. The wall was 10 feet high. The weeds were crushed outward. He had taken off his shoes to climb, so he wouldn't leave muddy streaks on the wall. I crouched down to examine the bare print. It was 7.5 inches long and 3 inches wide. The arch was average, but the second and third toes were pressed tight together. There was almost no gap. My voice caught in my throat. When my father taught me the codes, he also taught me how to read tracks. The men in the Shin family have a physical trait. On the left foot, the second and third toes are webbed. They are born joined together. The way we walk and the shape of the print is different from anyone else. I stood up and walked back to the stone stool. I brushed away the moss and found a faint scratching. It was carved with a fingernail, the strokes as thin as hair. The gray stone peeked through the green moss. 5 words. Year. Don't investigate anymore. My heart stopped. That was what my father called me. He always said it with a soft accent from our hometown. The last time I heard him say it was when I was 13. He was dying, clutching my sleeve, whispering that he was sorry. He died the next day. The scratches were fresh. The edges of the moss were still damp. This was done last night, or the night before. This wasn't a rumor. This was a warning from someone who knew every intimate detail of my life. I pulled my hand back and clenched my fist. I turned and ran toward the front of the shop. Gu Shuangshu shouted, asking where I was going, but I didn't answer. I missed one thing. Near the corner of the wall, there was another line of text. The morning light hit it just right, revealing the rough outline. The handwriting was frantic and messy. The strokes were long, as if the person had been sliding their finger across the ground while running toward the back window. Must leave. He is already here. I vanished into the alley, heading straight for the mortuary in the west of the city. Thunder rolled across the sky. People on the street started to hurry. On a wall nearby, a chalk drawing of a lotus made by children was hit by the first drop of rain. The white powder smeared into a gray blur. I spent 2 hours inside the mortuary. The old records were piled in a side room, smelling of rot and damp paper. I finally found the page for my father's burial. There were 2 different sets of handwriting on the entry. One was neat and professional. The horizontal strokes were clean. The vertical strokes were pulled inward. It was a perfect match for my father's handwriting, etched into my memory. The other entry was the signature of the body collector. The writing was messy, the ink faded, and it consisted of only a single surname. By the time I returned to the bookstore, the rain had stopped. A deep orange sunset burned across the horizon. Gu Shuangshu sat behind the counter, sliding a whetstone against his short sword. The sound was rhythmic and sharp, like a cold, metallic heartbeat. Find anything? He asked, not looking up. 2 things. I walked to the counter and spread the burial record from the mortuary onto the wood. First, my father wrote his own burial record. Gu Shuangshu's hand stopped moving. He went to the mortuary 3 days before he died, I said, pointing to the neat rows of small characters. Name, age, cause of death, burial location. It's all his handwriting. He filled it out, signed it, paid a deposit, and then went home to wait for death. He knew it was coming. He knew, Gu Shuangshu muttered. And he arranged everything. I moved my finger to the messy signature at the bottom. Second thing, the body collector's signature. The surname is Xie. At first, I didn't think much of it. There are dozens of families named Xie in Songlong City. But I asked the manager on my way out. The mortuary hasn't employed a collector named Xie in 40 years. I looked at the jagged strokes. The signature is a forgery. The man who collected my father's body used the name Xie on purpose. Gu Shuangshu put down the whetstone. So he was leaving you a sign. He was telling me he was here. I whispered. The shop fell silent. A sliver of sunset leaked through a crack in the door, drawing a long, thin red line across the floor. I folded the record and tucked it into my robe. I stood there for a moment, then frowned. Do you smell that? I asked. Gu Shuangshu sniffed the air. There was a faint scent of something burnt, buried beneath the usual smell of old paper and ink. Candles, he said. Someone lit a candle. But not in here. I looked down at my feet. The smell was seeping up through the floorboards. The shop was floored with old blue bricks, the gaps filled with white lime. I walked to the corner behind the counter and shoved aside several bundles of old books. One brick looked different. The lime around its edges was lighter, as if it had been recently disturbed. I hooked my fingers into the gap and pulled. The brick came up easily, revealing a dark, gaping hole. A draft of cold, damp air rushed up, carrying the stench of burnt wax and raw earth. It's a cellar, I said. The landlord never mentioned it when I rented this place. I found it myself. Have you been down there? Once, 3 years ago. It was empty, so I sealed it up. But now, someone has pried it open. I lit a candle and led the way down the narrow stone steps. They were barely wide enough for one person. The stone felt smooth and polished under my boots. This wasn't how a staircase that hadn't been touched in 3 years should feel. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet square. The walls were rough brick covered in white saltpeter, and the floor was packed earth. In the corner, someone had spread a layer of dry straw. On top of the straw sat a neatly folded old blanket. Next to it was a piece of dried bread, hard as a rock, and a spent candle stub that had melted into a white scar on the ground. Someone lived here, Gu Shuangshu said, kneeling by the straw. He touched the bread. This is hard enough to be 4 or 5 days old. But there's no mold. They left less than a week ago. Less than 3 days, I corrected. I pointed to a short strand of hair trapped in the dried wax. There's no dust on this hair yet. Based on how fast dust settles down here, this fell less than 48 hours ago. They left right around the time the rainy night killers attacked us. I stood up and scanned the walls. The candlelight was weak, leaving the corners in thick, ink-like shadows. When I reached the eastern wall, I stopped. A small iron pot, the kind travelers carry, sat in the corner. A thin crust of dried porridge remained at the bottom. Beside it was a sheepskin water skin, its cap loose, leaving a dark ring on the dirt floor. Underneath the water skin was a piece of paper. I moved the skin and held the paper to the light. It was high-quality cloud pattern paper, the exact same kind I had found shredded in the backyard. There were only 6 words written in common pine soot ink, but the style was identical to the warning on the wall. Song Foam is still alive. Su Su. The last character was unfinished. The final stroke dragged out into a long, jagged smear, as if the writer had been interrupted or forced to stop. I looked closer. There were 2 tiny splatters of ink flying outward in a V shape. Someone struck the pen out of his hand, I said, pointing to the spots. The ink flew from right to left. If he had stopped on his own, it wouldn't look like this. Someone grabbed him or covered his mouth from the right side. The candle flame flickered violently. Gu Shuangshu gripped his sword, glancing back toward the stairs. Is someone else down here? No. I'm just guessing what happened to him. I looked back at the bottom of the note. There was a signature written in a frantic, heavy hand that had nearly punctured the paper. Shinqingshi. Shinqingshi, Gu Shuangshu read aloud. Do you know him? I didn't answer immediately. I watched the signature as the candlelight danced across the page. I don't, I said slowly. But my father's generation followed a naming pattern. His name was Shinqingshan. Shinqingshi. It sounds like a brother. You've never heard of an uncle? My father said he had no brothers. He He told me they all died by the Songlong River. I folded the note. Maybe he didn't die. Maybe he's the man who sat under the old locust tree all night. He lived in this cellar for days. He was writing this to me when someone took him. I looked at the iron pot again. The dried porridge at the bottom was plain white rice. It was exactly what I cooked for breakfast every morning. I hadn't been in the cellar for years, and I never counted the grains of rice in my kitchen. This man, my supposed uncle, had been stealing my rice while I was away. He had been using the leftover heat from my stove to cook while I slept. He lived beneath my feet, ate my food, and tried to leave me a message, only to vanish into the night, likely the same rainy night the killers broke down my door. I looked up, scanning the cellar one last time. As the candlelight swept across the far corner, something caught my eye. I found something else hidden behind the iron pot. It was a pair of cloth shoes, placed side by side with the toes pointing outward and the heels neatly aligned. The soles were worn thin, so thin I could see the texture of the hemp threads underneath. On the left sole, there was a hole the size of a copper coin, patched from the inside with a layer of dry grass. I remembered the barefoot print I found by the backyard wall. The man had taken off his shoes before climbing over, but he hadn't taken them with him. He left them here. A man traveling at night doesn't just abandon his shoes unless he never plans to walk in them again, or unless he knew, before taking them off, that he would never get the chance to put them back on. I handed the candle to Gu Shuangshu and leaned down to pick them up. Inside the heel of each shoe, words had been carved into the fabric with a fingernail. The left shoe said, "Run fast." The right shoe said, "Don't come back." The jagged curves of the marks matched the 5 words I'd found on the stone stool earlier. It was the same man. I turned and headed for the stairs, stuffing the shoes into my tunic as I climbed. The stone steps echoed with a dull, heavy thud. Gu Shuangshu followed close behind with the light. I reached the trapdoor and shoved it open with all my strength. A rush of cold night air flooded in, making the candle flame flicker violently. I stood in the draft and looked back at him. He knew this place was compromised, I said. That's why he left the note unfinished. He took off his shoes and climbed the wall to lead them away. If he's still alive, he'll find a way to send another message. If he's not, then the next message will come from the person who took him. I paused and pulled out the funeral record I'd taken from the courier station. In the dim light, the messy signature for Xie had a faint, purplish tint. It wasn't the standard pine soot ink my uncle had used in the cellar. This ink glowed with a dark, subtle violet hue under the fading light of the sky. It was the exact same ink my father used to use. The station manager said no collector named Xie had existed for decades. But the ink didn't lie. Xie Jiao, who supposedly died 40 years ago by the Songlong River, couldn't have signed this. Whoever signed for him used my father's ink, my father's style of seal, and that specific way my father tucked his vertical brushstrokes inward. I refolded the record and tucked it against my chest, right next to the unfinished letter. A father dead for 10 years, an uncle I never knew existed, and a name that should have been bleached bone 40 years ago. The 3 papers felt like 3 shards of ice against my skin. Night seeped through the cracks in the door. The last glow of twilight in the bookshop died out. Gu Shuangshu blew out the candle. In the darkness, his voice was low. "What happens next?" "An invitation from Pei Jingjia," I answered instinctively. The second son of the Pei family, one of the 7-star clans. He sent a letter inviting me to view a painting. He said the painting features a sword. I took a breath. The sword is named Song Feng. Silence fell between us. It wasn't just because the timing was too perfect. It was because the moment the name Song Feng left my lips, there was a knock at the shop door. Not a frantic pounding, but 3 deliberate, measured strikes. I walked to the door and pulled back the bolt. No one was there. Resting on the stone step was a juju-bread envelope with a gold-dusted seal. The 7-star tower emblem shimmered coldly in the dusk. The messenger was already gone, a shadow vanishing at the end of the alley like a leaf caught in a gale. I picked up the invitation but didn't open it. I stared into the darkness where the man had disappeared, then shoved the letter into my robe and shut the door. "Aren't you going to read it?" Gu Shuangshu asked. "No rush," I said, placing it on the counter. The messenger has incredible footwork, yet he made sure I saw his back. He was sending a message. They can come and go whenever they please. Gu Shuangshu didn't respond. He He leaned back in his chair. He looked better than he had a few days ago, but his lips were still bloodless. The wounds on his chest were scabbing, and his back was healing, but he was at least a month away from being able to fight. The next morning, he left. I didn't ask where he was going, and he didn't offer. In the Heaven's secret pavilion, assassins don't ask about their partner's movements. Whether we were actually partners now was something neither of us had acknowledged. He returned at dusk. I was busy repairing the door panel that had been split by a blade. I was using a plane to smooth the edges, filling the gaps with a mixture of sawdust and fish glue. My woodworking wasn't half bad. It could rival the coffin shop down the street. The pavilion issued a death warrant, Gu Shuangshu said, his voice raspy as if he'd walked a long way. The 72 earthly fiends have been mobilized. My plane stuttered for a second before I continued the stroke. All 72, just to catch one discard assassin like you. Not just me. Gu Shuangshu looked at me intently. They're coming for you, too. I set the plane down and turned around. Why? I went back to a contact point outside Songlong City, he said, pulling a crumpled slip of paper from his tunic. I found this. The paper had 4 words written in a frantic, messy hand. Target, Songfeng. This is the original mission slip from the client, Gu Shuangshu explained. Not the one they increased the bounty on later. The very first one. The person who hired us to kill you didn't write your name. They wrote Songfeng. I took the paper. It was cheap, common stationery with no identifying marks. The handwriting was rushed, but there was a strange detail. The horizontal strokes ended with a tiny, jagged hesitation, as if the writer's hand wasn't steady. Have you heard that name before? He asked. No, I said. It was the truth, but the name felt like a fishbone stuck in my throat. My father's iron medallion was engraved with foam. Gu Shuangshu's medallion was engraved with song. Put them together, and you got the name. It wasn't a person, it was 2 halves of a single thing. One half had been with me, the other with him. The client isn't looking for me, I said slowly. They're looking for Songfeng. But the data they gave the pavilion was all my information. That means in their eyes, Shen Knight and Songfeng are the same. Or at least, they think I know where Songfeng is. Then why hire an assassin? Gu Shuangshu countered. If they wanted the location, they should have taken you alive. Killing you is about silencing you. I handed the slip back. They're afraid I'll talk. They think I know something I don't. Or rather, they think I might remember something at any moment. They want me dead before that happens. Gu Shuangshu's gaze shifted to the hidden compartment in my counter. Someone had tampered with it. They had flipped through my book, the Gongqi Luan, and cut out page 17. They weren't there to learn martial arts. They were looking for something, or confirming that something was gone. The hand of the creator page, Gu Shuangshu said suddenly. Are you sure it was stolen? I didn't answer. You told me that page only contained a fragment, he continued. It lacked the closing technique. Anyone who practiced it would have their meridians shattered. If the thief knew that, why steal it? Because he didn't know it was a fragment, I said. Or maybe he knew, and he just didn't care. Didn't care? The hand of the creator has 49 palms, I explained. Each one is more powerful than the last. Without the closing technique, you can shatter stone by the 3rd palm. By the 7th, you can rupture a man's internal organs from a distance. For most people, mastering the 7th palm is more than enough power. As for what happens after the 49th palm, they either think they'll magically find the missing technique, or they simply don't care. They're willing to gamble their lives for a taste of godhood. Gu Shuangshu stayed silent. He knew I was right. The martial world has never lacked men who would trade their souls for strength. If a fragment of the hand of the creator leaked out, even just the beginning, it would turn whoever found it into a killing machine, until the final palm eventually destroyed them from the inside out. The thief knew the book was in your hands, Gu Shuangshu said. He knew about the hidden compartment. He knew page 17 held the technique. He must have known it was a fragment. Yes, I replied. And he stole it anyway. To practice it. We both fell silent. Outside the shop, a beggar was singing a folk song in a raspy, haunting voice, telling an old story from a forgotten dynasty. The setting sun bled through the cracks in the door, casting long, jagged stripes of light and shadow across my face. 3 days later, the news arrived. It didn't come from the pavilion or the 7 great families. It came from the local magistrate's office. A new wanted poster had been slapped onto the bulletin board at the city gates. The reward was 50 silver taels for a masked man in black. The description was brief, but one detail stood out. A nameless male corpse had been found on the riverbank 3 miles outside the city. There were no external wounds. The man had died with a peaceful smile on his face. Old Wong from the pawn shop next door brought the news. He was a talker. He stood by my door for the time it took to drink a cup of tea, relaying 70% of the coroner's report. My expression didn't change as I listened, but my hand stopped moving for a single heartbeat. It was a tiny hesitation. One Old Wong didn't notice, but Gu Xuanshu saw it. After Old Wong left, I put down the carving I was working on and wiped my hands. What was the cause of death? Gu Xuanshu asked. The coroner couldn't figure it out, I said. He said the victim looked like he was sleeping. No poison, no internal bleeding. But when they cut open the chest, I paused. They found the heart had been shattered. Gu Xuanshu's pupils contracted. Shattered. Split into 3 pieces. But the pericardium was intact. Not a single rib was broken. The palm force passed through the bone, the muscle, and the membrane to strike only the heart. It didn't damage anything else. My voice was steady, but my knuckles were white as I gripped the edge of the counter. This technique is called the heart-crushing hand. The first palm, Gu Xuanshu whispered. Right. The first palm, the opening cup. It only shatters hard objects, leaving soft tissue untouched. The thief has practiced for 3 days and can already destroy a heart without leaving a bruise. In 3 more days, he'll master the third palm. By then, he'll be able to kill from a distance. I didn't finish the thought. Outside, children ran through the alley, their footsteps splashing on the stone pavement, their laughter bright and innocent. I stared at the crack in my door, the one I had split with a blade and repaired with fish glue. You said last night that only 3 people knew about that page, Gu Xuanshu said. You, me, and Xiejio. Yes. I didn't steal it. You didn't steal it. That leaves Xiejio, I said. But Xiejio has been dead for 40 years. You also said that just because the whole world knows something doesn't mean it's true. I didn't argue. I looked at that crack in the door and thought of the rainy night. I thought of the bare footprint under the locust tree and the cloth shoes neatly tucked into the corner of the cellar. Shinqingshi. Xiejio. Those 2 names swirled in my head like 2 fish trapped in shallow water. If it wasn't Xiejio, I said, then it's someone who knew his connection to the book. Someone like the other person who survived the massacre back then. Shinqingshi. I stood up, went behind the counter, and opened the hidden compartment again. I pulled out the book and flipped to page 17. The jagged gap where the page had been torn out looked like a scar that wouldn't heal. My uncle had written, Asterisk Song Fong is still alive. Su, asterisk. Su what? Su Lai? Su Li? My finger traced the edge of the tear. If he knew that stealing this page would lead to someone practicing the heart-crushing hand, he probably knew who the killer was. But he didn't tell me. He didn't have time. His brush had been knocked away mid-sentence. He had been forced to leave so quickly he didn't even put on his shoes. I closed the book. My gaze fell on an unopened invitation on the counter. It was deep red with gold leaf stamping. The 7-star tower emblem shimmered in the candlelight. I tore it open. The handwriting inside was elegant, written on high-quality cloud paper. Tomorrow at the hour of the horse. A sword viewing at the Pei estate. The sword sings of Song Fong. Signed, Peijingzhe. I laid the paper on the table. Gu Xuanshu leaned over to look. Peijingzhe, he said. The second son of the Pei family. The youngest leader among the 7 great families. Do you know him? I've never met him, but I know of him. Gu Xuanshu's voice took on a rare tone of caution. The Pei family is the most low-profile of the great families, but they are also the best informed. They say Peijingzhe took over at 18. Within 3 years, he rebuilt their intelligence network and moved the family from the bottom rank to the top 3. He doesn't fight in the streets, but he knows everything that happens in the world. Then why invite me to look at a sword? Maybe he wants to see what Song Fong actually looks like. I didn't answer. I flipped the invitation over. On the back, in tiny, almost invisible script, was another line. I can give you the answer regarding the heart-crushing hand. I slowly lowered the paper. The last bit of twilight was fading outside. The bookshelves cast long, skeletal shadows across the shop. Gu Xuanshu lit an oil lamp. the flame dancing before settling into a steady glow. "Are you going?" he asked. "I have to." I folded the invitation and tucked it into my robe, right next to the unfinished letter from the seller and the forged burial record. Those 3 thin pieces of paper felt cold against my chest. "You aren't afraid it's a trap?" "Even if it is, I have no choice," I said. "The thief has mastered the first palm. In 3 days, he'll have the third. By then, it won't just be one nameless body on a riverbank. The reward on the wanted poster will jump to 500 silver, then 5,000. Eventually, no one will post a reward at all, because no one will be left alive who dares to." Gu Shuangshu was silent for a moment. "I'm coming with you. Your wounds aren't healed. I won't be fighting, but my eyes still work." 11 years of training at the pavilion wasn't just about learning how to kill. I looked at him. His face was still pale in the lamplight, but his eyes had regained that razor-sharp edge. I nodded. "Tomorrow, the hour of the horse. The Pei estate." Outside, night had fully claimed the city. The alley was empty. The chalk lotus flowers the children had drawn on the walls had blurred into white smudges from the rain. The lantern at the pawnshop flickered, casting a dim yellow glow on the old locust tree. Its branches swayed in the wind, making a dry, scratching sound, like someone, somewhere, was sharpening a blade. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and a thick fog had already swallowed the alley. In Songlang City, the mist always crawled up from the riverbank, hugging the bluestone paths and seeping through every crack in the doorframes. I pushed open the shop door and saw nothing but a wall of white. Even the lantern at the pawnshop next door was reduced to a faint, blurry red dot. I turned back inside and hid the book on public instruments back into its secret compartment. Before I snapped the iron box shut, my finger lingered on the gap at page 17. The edge where the page had been cut was smooth and neat. Touching it felt like feeling a scar where the skin had healed, but the bone underneath remained broken. The invitation from the Pei estate sat on my counter, face up. The small characters on the back were sharp in the morning light. "I can tell you the answer to the heart-crushing hand." Gu Shuangshu emerged from the backyard. He had changed into a clean, gray short robe, his short sword tucked into his waist. He looked better today. His lips weren't cracked anymore, and he didn't need the wall for support when he walked. "It's still early," he said. "What are you doing today?" "Waiting," I replied, flipping the invitation face down on the table. Since Pei Jingzhe dared to write that sentence, he clearly knew more than I did. I told Gu Shuangshu that I didn't plan on investigating anything else until we went to the estate. I was lying. I couldn't wait. The unfinished words "Xie" my father tried to say before he died, the frantic letter in the cellar, the forged signature on the burial record, and the warning carved into the stone seat in the backyard, all of it was swirling in my head. I hadn't slept at all. I spent the night laying out every clue on the counter, rearranging them, tearing down my theories, and starting over. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with only a few jagged pieces and no picture to guide me. All signs pointed to the same group, the swordcasters. But I knew too little about them. My father never spoke of them, and I never dared to ask. All I knew was that 40 years ago, 3,000 people died by the Songlang River. I knew my father was a survivor of that massacre. And I knew that swordcaster was a forbidden name in the martial world, a word that invited death the moment it left your lips. Well, death had already found me. The fog grew thicker. Just as I was about to put the door planks back up, I heard footsteps in the alley. They were light, steady, and deliberate. Each step landed right in the center of the stone slabs. This wasn't a passerby. They were coming for the shop. A white shadow emerged from the mist. It was a woman dressed in clothes as white as snow, or perhaps a mourning shroud. In the gray fog, she was blinding. She didn't have an umbrella, and tiny droplets of moisture clung to her hair, but she didn't seem to care. She stopped at my door, looked up at the sign, and peered inside past the broken planks. "Song Mo Bookshop," she read aloud. Her voice was as clear as porcelain. "Is Mr. Shinyi in?" I stayed by the door, unmoving. "Who are you?" The woman smiled slightly. It was a faint, polite smile, the kind used to confirm a suspicion. "My name is Bai Lu. I am a descendant of the sword-caster survivors. I am also the last remaining lamp-bearer." Behind me, I heard Gu Shuangshu's grip tighten on his sword. The title lamp-bearer hadn't been heard in the martial world for 40 years. After the sword casters were wiped out, the lamp bearers, their external messengers, were hunted down and purged. It was said the last one died under the combined pursuit of the 7 great families, biting off their own tongue so they wouldn't speak a word. The lamp bearers are all dead, Gu Shuangshu said, his voice cold and hard. The world thinks we are dead, Bai Lu nodded, her expression calm. That is the only reason we were able to survive. She shifted her gaze past me into the shop. Her eyes were strange. They didn't have that sharp, metallic glint like Gu Shuangshu's. Instead, they were warm and soft, like a pearl glowing in deep water. Being watched by her made my defensiveness feel unnecessary. What do you want? I asked. Bai Lu looked at my face as if she were trying to recognize something. I'm not here to cause trouble. I only want to confirm one thing. She paused. Who was the last person your father, Xin Qingshan, saw before he died? The question caught me off guard. I remained silent for a moment. I was 14 when my father passed. I remembered him lying in bed, his breath getting shallower. I had held his hand, but it was icy cold, his fingers curled so tightly I couldn't straighten them. In the afternoon of his final day, a man had come to the door. He was a Taoist in a gray robe, a gourd hanging from his waist. He was thin, with graying hair. When he walked into the room, my father's eyes had suddenly lit up. At the time, I thought it was just a final surge of life, but looking back, it must have meant something else. A Taoist, I finally said. Do you know him? I don't, she replied. After he arrived, my father told me to leave the room. He said they had things to discuss. I sat outside for a long time. I could hear my father's voice. He was arguing with the Taoist. They spoke in low tones, but my father sounded agitated, like he was opposing something. And then the Taoist left. He didn't even look at me. When I went back inside, my father was weaker than before. He lay there with his eyes closed, his lips moving constantly. I leaned in to listen, but he didn't make a sound. That night, he was gone. Bai Lu listened quietly. She lowered her head, processing the story. That Taoist, she said, her voice dropping an octave, was my uncle. The shop went dead silent. Wisps of fog drifted through the cracks in the door, curling around the bookshelves like ghosts. After he left your house, he rushed back to our hiding place through the night, she continued. He told me, Song Feng is still alive. Xin Qingshan has hidden it well. As soon as he finished that sentence, he began vomiting blood. His face turned purple. He died right in front of me. Her voice was steady, like she was recounting an old story she had repeated 1,000 times. But the calm only made the weight of her words heavier. The 7 great families poisoned him. They used a slow-acting toxin called rebirth chrysanthemum. If he used his internal energy for more than 15 minutes, the poison would trigger. He knew he would die, but he ran all the way from Tsonglang City anyway. He had to get that message to my father before the poison took him. That one sentence was all he had time for. Bai Lu looked up at me. I came to find you because I need to know more. Did your father tell you why he was against it? What exactly is Song Feng? What were they arguing about? I slowly shook my head. I remembered every detail of that afternoon. The sweat on my father's brow, the sound of the Taoist's footsteps, the smell of medicine in the room. But I truly didn't know. At 14, I didn't even know the words swordcaster or Song Feng existed. How many years have you been looking for Song Feng? I asked her. 10 years, Bai Lu said. I've been searching since I became the lamp bearer at 16. I've found 7 surviving direct lineages of the swordcasters. I've found 11 hidden secret techniques. I've even found the hit list the 7 great families used to hunt us. She paused, taking a half step forward as the fog swirled around her feet. Her eyes locked onto mine. But I have never been able to find Song Feng. The image of my bookshop sign reflected in my eyes as I processed Bai Lu's words. Song Feng wasn't a person. It wasn't a single sword or a secret manual. It was a capability, the power to integrate 36 scattered mental cultivation fragments into one. Without Song Feng, those 36 techniques were just broken pieces. With it, they became a complete, unstoppable force. The swordcasters had poured everything into nurturing Song Feng, waiting for the right moment to unite the techniques and achieve their grand ambition. As she finished, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought of the wooden board I found in the corner of my backyard. Leave. He's already here. I thought of the bare footprints with the distinct toe marks unique to the Shin men. I thought of the carvings on the stone stool. Yi, stop investigating. Are you Tsong Feng? Bailu's voice was soft, barely a whisper. I don't know, I said. And I didn't. But as the words left my mouth, I felt the 3 pieces of paper tucked against my chest. The funeral record, the unfinished letter, and Pei Jingzhe's invitation suddenly turned searing hot. Then the killings began. When the first body was found, the local constables treated it like a common crime. It was a nameless male corpse discovered at Sanli River Beach. His heart was shattered, yet there wasn't a single scratch on his skin. The coroner couldn't find a cause of death and lazily ruled it as a sudden illness. People lived and died every day in Songlang City. A nameless outsider wasn't worth the paperwork. But on the morning the third body appeared, everything changed. The victim was Shopkeeper Chun, the owner of the Southern Rice Shop. He was a sturdy man who had been hauling heavy sacks of rice just the day before. The next morning, his assistant found him lying behind the counter, staring at the ceiling. He had a faint smile on his face, as if he were in the middle of a beautiful dream. When the assistant touched him, he was ice cold. The coroner opened his chest and found the heart shattered into 3 pieces. The pericardium was intact. The ribs were unbroken. There were no external wounds. The news spread faster than a plague. In every tea house and wine shop in Songlang City, people whispered about this smiling corpse. He died smiling. It was eerie. It wasn't poison. It wasn't a blade. His heart had simply exploded from the inside. The martial artists in town knew exactly what kind of technique could do that, but nobody dared to say the name out loud. The name itself was a curse. I started my own investigation on the 5th day. I hadn't planned to get involved. I had Pei Jingzhe's invitation sitting on my counter, and I didn't want any trouble before our meeting the next day. But the 5th victim changed everything. His name was Sun Bowen. He was a teacher at the private school in the east end of the city. He had taught for 30 years and was respected by everyone. He died exactly like the others, a peaceful smile and a shattered heart. I walked into Sun's study, a room overflowing with old books. My eyes immediately landed on a row of blue-covered manuscripts on the top shelf. I knew that binding instantly. Dark blue coarse cloth, white thread stitching, and brass-wrapped corners. It was my father's signature work. Years ago, my father, Shen Qingshan, made his living as a transcriber. He copied everything: classics, star charts, medical texts. Every book he touched was bound this way. It was unique to him in all of Songlang City. These books, I let my fingers linger on the spine. My father bought them 5 years ago, Sun said, wiping away tears. The transcriber came by several times and sold him over a dozen. My father said the handwriting was beautiful and the binding was sturdy. Was his name Shen Qingshan? The son thought for a moment and nodded. I think so. Not very tall. He had a scar between the fingers of his right hand. I didn't ask anything else. As I walked out of the Sun house, the sky was heavy with gray clouds. A terrifying thought took root in my mind. I spent the entire night digging into the backgrounds of the 5 victims. Shopkeeper Chun had 3 books copied by my father. Zhao Chaofeng, the pawnbroker, had a manual hidden under his shelf. Lu Longzhong, the pharmacist, possessed a medical text my father had transcribed, the very one that described the hair-stitching technique. That made 4 people. The 5th was the nameless man at the river. I couldn't prove it, but I was certain he had one of my father's books too. All of them had purchased my father's transcriptions years ago. The realization made my blood run cold. The killer wasn't choosing victims at random. He was hunting for something hidden inside those books. He was looking for the second half of the Gong Chi Luan fragments. I rushed back to my shop and tore through the 100 or so books my father had left me. Only one of them contained the hidden content of the Gong Chi Luan, the one my father had specifically left for me. The thief had already stolen page 17, but that page was incomplete. It lacked the closing technique. To master the full, heart-crushing poem, the killer needed the rest. But he couldn't find them easily. My father had dismantled the second half of the manual and scattered the pages, hiding them inside different books sold to different people. Each page was a fragment. Each page held a secret formula. The thief didn't know which books held the fragments, but he knew my father's binding style. So he found Sun Bowen. He killed him and ransacked his shelves. Then he found Chun, Zhao, and Lu. One by one, he murdered them and flipped through their books. He was completing the manual through a trail of blood. I sat in my shop and listed the victims in order of their deaths, matching them against the page numbers I remembered from the Gongqi Luan. The Nameless Man at the River, page 1, the general outline. Shopkeeper Chun, page 7, the third move, Crushing Stone. Zhao Chaofeng, page 11, the fifth move, Armor Breaker. Lu Longzhong, page 15, the seventh move, Mountain Splitter. Sun Bowen, page 17, the ninth move, Heart Crusher. Every time the killer mastered a move, he used it to kill the next person. By the time he reached the pharmacist, he could strike through a wall and shatter a man's heart from 3 feet away. The speed of his progress was terrifying. For a normal person, mastering a palm technique takes years. This person had reached the ninth move in less than 10 days. Either he was a genius, or he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. My finger stopped on the list. With Sun Bowen dead, the killer had everything from the first 17 pages. But the heart-crushing palm had 49 moves in total. He was still missing 32 pages. Where would my father hide those? I thought of the unfinished letter in the cellar. My uncle, Shin Qingshi, said he had been tracking this person's movements for a long time. Was this what he was investigating? Then I remembered the words by Lu's uncle died to deliver. Song Feng is still alive. My father had hidden him well, but he hadn't just hidden Song Feng. He had hidden the second half of the heart-crushing palm, a technique so dangerous it could turn the martial arts world upside down. He had broken it apart and placed the pieces in the hands of ordinary people who had no idea what they were holding. Someone was looking for what my father had hidden. They were searching page by page, life by life. I didn't notice Gu Shuangshu standing behind me until I looked up. He stared at the list of the dead in silence. His face was unreadable. Tomorrow at the hour, I said, my voice steady despite the chill in the room. I'm going to ask Pei Jingzhe if his answer is truly worth 5 lives. Outside, the night in Songlong City was as thick as ink. A low whistle echoed from the distant river, sounding like a heavy sigh lost in the darkness. After returning from Sun Bowen's house, I sat in my bookshop for hours. I didn't light a lamp. I just stared into the blackness, fixating on an invisible point on the ceiling. The names of the 5 victims drifted through my mind like chess pieces on a board. The Nameless Master at Sonli Beach. Shopkeeper Chun. Zhao Chaofeng. Dr. Lu. Sun Bowen. Each died the same way. Each had a book hand-copied by my father on their shelf. The order of their deaths matched the sequence of the Night Horse chapter in the Gongqi Luan. The killer was following a map, but his map was incomplete. He had reached page 17 and mastered the first 17 moves, but he didn't know where the remaining 32 were hidden. Right now, he was probably huddled in some dark corner, frantically flipping through the stolen manuscripts, searching those neat, small characters for the next clue. I sat up abruptly. If my father had scattered the missing pages across different books, did the copy of Gongqi Luan he left for me hold a secret I'd missed? I lit the oil lamp and pulled the iron box from the hidden compartment. The book lay there, its title shimmering faintly in the candlelight. I flipped to page 17. The gap where the page had been cut out was still there, clean and sharp, like a wound that would never heal. I ran my finger along the edge, feeling the texture of the paper. Then, I turned to the inside of the back cover. The crescent-shaped nail mark, the warning that someone had been here, was still visible. I had checked this dozens of times, but this time, I noticed something new. The mark was in the bottom right corner. Usually, a person's eyes would be drawn to the mark itself, but the tip of the crescent pointed toward the gap between the binding thread and the cover. I held the book closer to the flame. There was a tiny slit there, no wider than a fingernail, hidden in the shadows of the hemp thread. I slipped my nail inside and felt something. It wasn't paper, it felt like fabric. I carefully teased out a roll of silk. It was as thin as a cicada's wing and no larger than my palm. It was completely blank. I wasn't disappointed. My heart actually started to race. I knew what this was. When my father copied books, he sometimes used a special liquid that turned invisible once it dried. It was a secret he never shared, one I had only seen him demonstrate once when I was 12. Remember this, he had told me back then, but never tell a soul. I went to the medicine cabinet in the corner of the shop and pulled out the bottom drawer. Bottles of all sizes were lined up. White root water, yellow grease, 5 purple leaf. I reached past them to the very back and found a small, unlabeled porcelain jar sealed with wax. I scraped off the wax and poured a few drops onto the silk. The liquid was colorless and odorless, but it gave off a faint blue glow under the candlelight. I spread it evenly and held my breath. The silk began to change. The edges turned yellow, and gray traces appeared in the center. The marks darkened into black characters. My hands started to shake as 7 words appeared in my father's distinct handwriting. Song foam is not a sword, but a person. I stared at those words for a long time. I thought of Gu Shuangshu's iron plate with the word song and the one my father left me with the word foam. I always thought song foam was a code name, a secret plan, or a legendary weapon. But my father was telling me the truth from beyond the grave. It was a person, a living human being hidden away, waiting to be found or killed. I looked further down. Below those 7 words was a line of smaller, more hurried text. My son, I have personally turned you into song foam. I slowly folded the silk. The shop was deathly quiet. The candle flickered, making my shadow dance against the wall. I tucked the silk into my robe along with the funeral records, the unfinished letter, and Pei Jingzha's invitation. The 4 pieces of paper felt ice-cold against my chest. I looked at the invitation on the counter. The gold-dusted words seemed to mock me. I can give you the answer regarding the heart-crushing palm. Pei Jingzha knew about the palm technique. He likely knew about song foam, too. He knew everything, yet he chose to dangle the truth in front of me like bait. It was a trap, a Hongmin banquet, where the host intended to kill the guest. But I had to go. The answers were in his hands, and a killer was still out there. I stood up and walked to the door. A thin sliver of white was breaking over the eastern horizon. Songlong City was still asleep, the cobblestone streets empty as the river mist crawled along the ground. It was a new day. I had exactly 8 hours before my appointment. I stayed behind the counter until the sun fully rose. I pulled out the foam, iron plate, and placed it next to Gu Shuangshu's song plate. They were identical, right down to the jagged pattern of the broken sword engraved on the back. Song foam is not a sword, but a person. My son, I have personally turned you into song foam. Those words felt like a fishbone stuck in my throat. I couldn't swallow them, and I couldn't spit them out. I gathered the plates and the papers, feeling the weight of the mystery pressing against my heart. It was time to meet Pei Jingzha. The silk scroll with its 7 mysterious words sat between the 2 iron plates, tucked against my chest. The 4 pieces of paper felt like shards of ice against my skin. You're going to the Pei estate today. Gu Shuangshu's voice drifted in from the backyard. He stood by the door, arms crossed. A short sword was tucked into his waist. His face was still pale from his injuries, but his eyes had regained that cold, sharp edge. I'm going with you, he stated. Your injuries. I started. I won't fight, Gu Shuangshu interrupted. But the 72 earthly fiends of the Tianji Pavilion are still out there looking for me. The Pei estate belongs to the 7-star families. It's not necessarily safer than this bookshop, but it's not more dangerous either. 2 people have 2 more eyes than 1. I thought about it for a moment and nodded. Fine. Wait here in the shop. I have to head to the south side of the city to handle something first. I didn't tell him exactly what I was doing, and he didn't ask. That was the unspoken understanding between us. Some things aren't worth asking because you won't get a straight answer anyway. I stepped out and headed south. The morning mist hadn't fully lifted, leaving the bluestone streets slick and damp. On the spirit wall, the lotus flowers the local kids had drawn were completely washed away by the rain, leaving nothing but a blurry white smudge. I wasn't going south for an errand. I was looking for someone, the widow of Manager Chun, the rice merchant. While investigating yesterday, I'd noticed a detail. After Manager Chun died, the 3 volumes of essential techniques for the peasantry that my father had hand-copied were missing from his study. The authorities hadn't seized them, and the family hadn't put them away. Someone had taken them. The killer had murdered Manager Chun, ransacked his shelves, and made off with every book my father had touched. But there was one place in the Chun house that hadn't been searched, the rice shop's accounting room. I hoped to find a lead they'd missed. I spent the entire morning digging through the ledgers, but I found nothing. The pages were packed with daily rice prices, inventory logs, and credit lists. There wasn't a single mention of my father. The killer had been thorough. They hadn't left me a crumb. By the time I returned to the bookshop, it was past noon. The sun was out, and old Wong from the pawnshop next door was dozing at his entrance. The shadow of the old locust tree stretched across the stones. Everything looked peaceful, lazy, and normal, but the shop door was slightly ajar. I stopped, my hand hovering over the wood. I hadn't left it like that. I had wrapped a single strand of hair around the handle, a trick I'd learned from Gu Shuangshu. The hair was snapped, fluttering on the threshold. I pushed the door open. The shop was tidy. No shelves were overturned, the counter was clean, and the chairs were in their places. But Gu Shuangshu was gone. His short sword was missing from the wall. He'd taken it with him. A note sat on the table, held down by an inkstone. The handwriting was frantic and hurried. It was Gu Shuangshu's script. Don't come. Just 2 words. No signature, no time, no explanation. I squeezed the note, my fingertips digging into the paper until it creased. I didn't panic. 3 years of copying books had taught me one thing. Panicking is the last thing you should do. I flipped the note over. Nothing. I held it up to the light. No hidden watermarks. I ran my fingers over it. No pinpricks or secret codes. This wasn't Tianji Pavilion cipher work. It was a plain, blunt warning. He had left in a rush, not even having time for a 3rd word. But since he took his sword, he hadn't been taken by force. He had left on his own. He had found something, or met someone, and decided to leave. Before he went, he used his final seconds to warn me. Don't come. Where shouldn't I go? The Pei estate? Or was he heading somewhere else? I folded the note and tucked it away. Now I had 5 pieces of paper against my chest. I hid the treatise on public instruments back in its secret compartment, locked the iron box, and replaced the floor brick. I washed my face, changed into a clean dark gray robe, and made sure the 2 iron plates were secure. It was almost time. Regardless of where Gu Shuangshu went or why he warned me off, I had to keep this appointment. The note on the back of the invitation was still burning a hole in my pocket. I can give you the answer regarding the heart-crushing palm. Whether Pei Jingzhe was a friend or a foe, whether his estate was a dragon's den or a tiger's lair, I needed that answer. The man who stole the books had already mastered the 9th style of the heart-crushing palm. 5 people were already dead in Songlong City. If Pei Jingzhe knew the killer's identity, the source of the manual, or where my father hid the rest of the fragments, I had to know. Any lead could save the next life. I slotted the door panels into place, snapped the lock, and turned into the alley. Old Wong was still napping. The leaves of the locust tree rustled overhead. The blurry white smudge on the wall glowed in the afternoon sun like a colorless lotus. The Pei estate was in the eastern district. Getting there from my shop meant crossing most of Songlong City. I walked slowly, watching everything. The fish stall at the alley entrance had a new face today. It wasn't the usual limping old man. It was a youth with incredible knife skills. Every cut he made was precise and lethal. In the 2nd-story window of a tea house, a man sat with his bamboo hat pulled low, hiding his face. But the way he held his cup gave him away. 3 fingers gripped the rim, the others slightly curved, the unmistakable grip of a concealed weapons expert. Even the fortune teller at the corner had changed. The pole for his banner was a fist width thicker than usual, thick enough to hide a flexible sword. The shadows of Songlong City were watching me. The Pei estate's entrance was humbler than I expected. No stone lions, no red-lacquered gates, no gold leaf plaques. Just gray walls and black tiles. A simple wooden plaque hung over the door with Pei Estate, written in elegant, balanced strokes. But I noticed the bluestone path out front was too smooth. It wasn't worn down by feet. It had been intentionally polished. Every stone fit perfectly, with no gaps. It was a mechanism. One wrong step, and the ground would become a trap. A young servant in green robes met me at the door. He looked about 15, with a clean face and a practiced smile. Mr. Shun, the 2nd young master, is waiting in the backyard. Please, follow me. I followed him through the front courtyard and down a winding corridor. The rockeries and ponds were arranged with meticulous care, but I saw the signs. Every stone in the rockery had been moved recently, positioned according to some hidden formation. The surface of the pond rippled in perfect circles even though there was no wind. Something was moving beneath the water. Every 3rd pillar in the corridor was a slightly lighter shade of wood. meaning they had been replaced. Likely hacked through by blades in the past. Pei Jingzhe stood in a pavilion in the backyard, his back to me. He was studying a painting hanging on a pillar. Hearing my footsteps, he turned around. I've seen many kinds of smiles. Fawning smiles, contemptuous smiles, smiles that hide daggers, and smiles that don't reach the eyes. Pei Jingzhe's smile was different. It was warm, so warm it made you want to drop your guard, which only made me twice as cautious. Brother Shun, I've looked forward to this, he said, bowing with fluid grace. I returned the gesture, scanning the pavilion. A jar of wine, 2 cups, and a plate of dried fruit sat on a stone table. The ink painting on the pillar depicted a single sword. The invitation said we were here to appreciate a sword, I said. But this is just a painting. I looked at the painting, but I couldn't see anything special about it. It was just an ink wash of a blade. Pei Jingzhe smiled and walked toward the pillar. He pointed his finger at a tiny detail where the blade met the hilt. The character was so small that I never would have noticed it without leaning in. Brother Shen, look here, he whispered. I took a step closer. The character was Tsong. This sword is called Tsong Feng, Pei Jingzhe said, turning back to meet my eyes. Legend says a master blacksmith spent 10 years forging it. It was meant to combine the ultimate techniques of 36 different martial arts schools. Whoever held it could change the entire landscape of the martial world. He paused, his expression turning grave. 40 years ago, the 7-star families wiped out the blacksmith's entire clan. They didn't do it for justice. They did it to find this sword. Did they find it? I asked. No, Pei Jingzhe said. The hilt vanished during the massacre, and the 36 scrolls of technique were scattered across the land. But the key to uniting them, the sword Tsong Feng, never appeared. The 7-star families have been searching for 40 years and found nothing. I looked at him, my pulse steady but my mind racing. Then why did you invite me here, young Master Pei? He picked up the wine jar and poured a cup for me. The liquid was crystal clear, and the aroma was elegant and light. Because 3 years ago, I received a message, he said. It told me that Tsong Feng isn't a sword. It isn't even a secret manual. He took a breath. Tsong Feng is a person hiding in Songlong City, running an unremarkable bookshop and making a living by copying manuscripts. He never shows his martial arts, but inside his head, he carries every single martial arts record of the blacksmith clan from before they were destroyed. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low hum. He doesn't even know he is Tsong Feng, because to keep him alive, his father hid his identity and his memory together. He stopped and raised his wine cup toward me. Brother Shun, that person is you. I stared at the clear wine in the cup. I didn't reach for it. I had expected this answer, but hearing it out loud felt heavy. It changed everything. I looked up at Pei Jingzhe's warm smile. How do you know all this? He set his cup down and pulled something from his sleeve. He placed it on the stone table. It was an envelope, yellowed with age and frayed at the corners. On the front, 4 characters were written in a steady, upright hand, for Jingzhe's eyes only. I recognized that handwriting instantly. It was my father's. This letter, Pei Jingzhe said, was written to me by your father, Shen Qingshan, 17 years ago. I was only 11 then, just named the successor of the Pei family. Your father told me that if he ever disappeared and you found yourself in trouble, I must help you once. He looked at the letter. In exchange, he gave me a copy of the Gong Chi Luan to keep safe for you. My fingers trembled. I suddenly remembered the 17th page of the Gong Chi Luan in my shop, the page that had been neatly cut out. If Pei Jingzhe had the copy, then the answers the thief was looking for were likely right here. This letter asks you to help me once. I asked. Yes, he replied. Then tell me the answer to the heart-crushing hand case. Pei Jingzhe's smile flickered for a second. He refilled my cup, the wine swirling in the light. I can't tell you directly, he said. Why not? Because the answer isn't the name of a killer. The answer is a choice. He looked me straight in the eye. I can tell you who the killer is. But first, you have to answer one question for me. What question? If you found out the killer was someone you knew, someone you've even seen recently, what would you do? The pavilion went silent. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the rockery remained. Then, I heard something else. Faint, hurried footsteps coming from outside the pavilion. I turned around. Through the moon gate, I saw a figure in white standing at the end of the corridor. It was Bai Lu. His face was deathly pale, and his white robes were stained with blood. It wasn't his own. He hurried to the pavilion and stopped, glancing at Pei Jingzhe before locking eyes with me. "Shenyi," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Is Gu Shuangshu missing?" My pupils drifted. "Do you know where he is?" "I do," Bai Lu said, taking a sharp breath. "I've been tracking him for 3 days. Because he's the one who stole the heart-crushing hand manual from you that night." The air in the pavilion turned cold. Bai Lu's words felt like a blade, cutting through the polite conversation. I stood there, still holding the cup Pei Jingzhe had poured. The wine didn't ripple. My hand was perfectly steady. But my gaze had changed. "What did you say?" I asked. Bai Lu stepped closer, emphasizing every word. "The manual that went missing from your shop. Gu Shuangshu took it." Silence fell over the garden. The weeds in the rockery hissed in the wind. Pei Jingzhe set down the wine jar and stepped back, letting the news sink in. "Proof," I said. My voice was calm, but anyone who knew me would hear the edge underneath. "Give me proof."